I like to think of it as an adaptive set of responses that has crossed over to maladaptive. Okay, so you had these things that were adaptive and that kept you alive, and now we've crossed over to maladaptation. So how do we rein it back in?
When a civilian enters any branch of the military, they go through a period of basic military training that's designed to change the way they think and act to turn them into a soldier, sailor, marine, airman, or Coast Guardsman.
Hard work, hard work. Hard work, hard work. Hard work.
This is seen as an important time in the individual's life, critical for the proper transition from being someone not in the military to part of one of the greatest fighting forces on the planet.
Earn my pay. Hard work, do it every day. Get up out of 2:45.
After a period of time in the military, however, there's little done in any branch of the service to help that service member transition their mindset to life as a veteran.
Hard work, that's what they say. Hard work, I earn my pay.
As we often say here in the Change Your POV podcast network, after one leaves the military, they're never going to be a civilian again. And they're no longer a service member. They're this entirely different third thing, a veteran, with all the experiences, knowledge, strengths, and challenges that go along with that word.
Hard work, manifest. Hard work, you gotta do it right. Hard work.
One of the most overlooked aspects of transition is a service member's mental health and wellness. If the veteran has their heart, mind, body, and spirit in the right place, and has a support network of family and friends to rely upon, then they're most likely going to have a successful transition. If those things are not in place, things can get challenging.
Hard work, in the early morning rain. Hard work, that's what they say.
I'm your host, Dwayne France, and I'm going to take you through a veteran mental health boot camp to give you some advanced training for your brain.
Fired up. Hard work, everybody on the plane. Hard work, gotta sit 'em on down. Hard work.
These episodes will cover the many different aspects of veteran mental health that I, as both a combat veteran and a clinical mental health counselor, see, experience, and support veterans with daily.
Hard work, I earn my pay. Hard work, hard work.
I'm going to be joined by both veterans and mental health professionals talking about what you need to know about the stigma against seeking support, the different areas we need to understand, and provide some resources for when you think you might need them.
That's what they say. Hard work, earn my pay. Hard work, do it every day.
Get up in the morning and out of the rack, because this is some information that could very well save your life. Welcome to Veteran Mental Health Boot Camp.
Another day's of work. Hard work, that's what they say.
So welcome back, folks, to this series of shows that we're going to be taking a look at how veteran mental health, specifically regarding looking at how some of the major concerns veterans face kind of go beyond post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury. As I talked about in the introductory episode in the series, many think that veteran mental health begins and ends with PTSD and traumatic brain injury. Now, those are absolutely critical concerns that veterans face, but there are other things that they experience that go way beyond that. Now, in order to look beyond PTSD and TBI, we first have to look at those concerns, and that's why I asked the guests today to join me to take a look at PTSD, what it is, what it isn't, what it means, and kind of have a good conversation about that. So as I also mentioned, I'll be bringing on guests to talk about each of the aspects of veteran mental health that I introduced in the first episode. There are many, many experts on PTSD that I could have invited, but my guests today bring a great perspective on the topic. They have literally studied PTSD and its impact on our nation's service members. In April of 2017, they co-authored an article that many of you might have seen, both on the online outlet The Conversation, but also republished by permission on Task and Purpose. The article, which is titled From Shellshock to PTSD, A Century of Invisible War Trauma, provides an overview of PTSD from a research perspective, and I'm going to be linking to that in the show notes, which you can find once we go live. So I'm going to introduce my guests briefly and invite them to share more. Dr. MaryCatherine McDonald is an assistant professor of philosophy at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. She received her Ph.D. from Boston University, her master's from the New School. Her most recent research examines combat trauma through the lens of phenomenology, psychology, and neuroscience, ultimately arguing that these three fields are necessary for understanding the phenomenon of trauma. And both as a veteran and a clinician, I can tell you that I absolutely agree. In the summer of 2015, Dr. McDonald received a grant to complete a research study on the process of reintegration from military to civilian life. She also received grants to complete a research study on yoga as adjunctive therapy to combat veterans. She is also interested in feminism, specifically issues surrounding embodiment and epistemic authority, early modern philosophy, and the philosophy of mind. My other guest, Dr. Marisa Brandt, began teaching the history, philosophy, and sociology of science at Lyman Briggs College in Michigan State University. She completed her Ph.D. in Communication and Science Studies at the UC San Diego in May 2013 and lectured at the Department of Communication and Science, Technology, and Society program at UC San Diego. While at UC San Diego, she also co-convened the Center for Humanities Comics Studies Research Group, worked in the Culture, Art, and Technology program, and collaborated with the Veterans Affairs Hospital in La Jolla to study innovations in mental health care using digital media. She's also the vice chair of the Cultural Studies Association Working Group on Culture and War. She's a freelance writer, writing coach, editor, comics creator, DIY enthusiast, voracious reader of novels. And so, folks, as you can tell, I think I'm going to be way out of my academic depth here with my my colleagues here. So, MaryCatherine and Marisa, welcome. MaryCatherine, would you like to say more about your background there?
Thank you. Sure. So, so I started looking at post-traumatic stress and sort of issues surrounding veteran reintegration in 2009. And that's not something that's usually tackled from a philosophical perspective, but it actually started, I was looking at narrativity, so this debate in philosophy about how much our self-identity is constituted by stories, the stories we tell about ourselves, the stories that other people tell about us, and things like that. And sort of simultaneously, I was seeing all these stories, and I remember in particular there was a front page story in the New York Times in 2009 about veteran reintegration and just sort of the trouble we were having. And I had just started to get interested in the philosophy of psychology, and I just completely fell down a rabbit hole. I started going to the International Trauma Conference, which happens to be held in Boston, which is where I was living at the time. And I really just started going because I was like, okay, I just want to understand this better. I want to understand what trauma is, how this might fit in with debates about narrativity, if it's an example that shows us, some of the ways that narrativity can shatter, right? If you have a traumatic incident. And what I found when I went to the trauma conference was that people were still debating about what trauma is, what constitutes post-traumatic stress disorder, and why it's so difficult to treat, particularly in regards to combat. And so I just became fascinated with this issue of veteran reintegration because, I don't know, I just felt this pull, like there has to be a better way. We have to be able to do this better. And so I just started doing research and all these projects, and kind of just started thinking about, okay, what can philosophy add to this conversation? And in particular, phenomenology, what can phenomenology add to this conversation? And how can it change the way that we think about post-traumatic stress post-traumatic stress symptoms? How can we rethink trauma? How can it maybe change treatment paradigms? How can we use philosophy to think critically about the way that we're thinking about trauma and the way that we're treating it? And so it just kind of blossomed into this whole research plan. And then
this thing that you do, it's very interesting. And you talk about that and talking about narrativity, and we have our story. I can see that an individual has a story of their life that they've built through their experiences. And that story of their life led them to join the military, and then something came along to disrupt that story and create a new story. And it's almost like a schism on a timeline. And then how do we integrate that experience into our story and then live this new story? Is that sort of what you're talking about?
Absolutely. I think that can happen. And that's true of any trauma, right? So you have this is who I am and this is who I'm going to be. And then you have this sort of interruption that shatters your idea of the future or your idea of yourself. But I think it's particularly interesting when it comes to combat, because I think that we have these deeply embedded ideas about what it means to be a soldier in our country in particular. And then you go to war and you have this, and I think that's what I'm looking at right now actually is training, how this sort of gets reinforced in training, this ideology about what it's like to go to war and what combat is going to look like and what your role is going to be. And then you go to combat and it may look very different than that. So I think this can also make reintegration really difficult, because you weren't just telling a story about yourself, that gets interrupted by trauma, but you were telling a story about who you were going to be as a soldier. And then you met combat and it didn't necessarily look the way that you thought it was going to look, because technology has changed and the way that we engage is very different, and it changes every time we have a new war and things like this. And then you have to kind of figure out how that fits in. And there's no like paradigm for that,
right. And I think that's, and I definitely want to come back to that, because I have a great experience about the theoretical concept of war versus the actual reality of combat. But I want to be able to give Marisa a chance to talk a little bit about maybe a little bit more after I didn't talk about in your introduction, or how did you get into this?
So I got into this in, I don't know, kind of a also sort of surprising way. So I was, when I came to start my graduate program in communication and science studies, I knew I was very interested in the politics of mental health care and treatment. And I was especially interested in cultural conversations about psychiatry and technology. And for most of the past several decades, when we've talked about psychiatry and technology, it's usually been in the terms of psychopharmaceuticals. And when I started kind of just casting my net widely to see what was an interesting way to think about these issues while I was doing my dissertation work, which I started my grad program in 2006, I started to notice all of these stories about veteran mental health care. And I would see basically two kinds of stories, right? I would see these stories about veterans coming home and the way that they were framed in terms of often, criminality and suicide and all these kind of negative social stigmas. And then I would see all these stories that were like amazing new innovation in PTSD treatment, right? And these kind of celebrations of these new technologies. And so I was wondering what's going on there? How do we have this disconnect, right? We have a technological enthusiasm and apparently all these wonderful things on the horizon, and yet we have all of these, all this concern, right? The problematization of the veteran. And being in San Diego, this was very much an issue of my community, right?
There's a naval and Marines, a large Naval and Marine Corps presence in San Diego.
Yeah, huge. And the VA system down there has, I think, 3 or 4 hospitals, and they consider themselves to be the flagship VA system. So I did a couple different projects trying to think about this stuff. And one of the sites where I got really interested in the technologies being developed was in the area of digital media, which was very convenient because I was already studying communication. So they like that. And as a communication scholar, you can do really fun things in thinking about communication technology, like thinking about what kind of models of the self, right, are actually built into these technologies, what ideas about what it means to be a person, to be healthy, right, Trying to think of good examples, but, like the idea of, you just think about a cell phone, right, is premised on the idea that we want to be connected to people far away from us. But I got really interested in particular, a project that was being developed a couple hours up I-5 at the University of Southern California called virtual reality exposure therapy.
Yep.
That's under a few different names. One system's called, the system I looked at was called originally Virtual Iraq/Afghanistan, and then they remarketed it under the acronym BraveMind. Yes, it's an acronym. The Battlefield Research Accelerating Virtual Environment for Military Individual Neurodisorders. And I just kind of became fascinated with that project, which we can talk about more in depth. And then I also spent about a year and change up in that lab studying what they did, how they came to understand what PTSD was, or did not always understand what it was. But grappled with that as a way of creating these immersive simulations of traumatic experience that are really the cornerstone of that intervention. And the other thing I did was I spent a few years going to a weekly PTSD training seminar for the clinical psychologists and psychiatrists who were doing their residencies at the VA in San Diego. And I got to see how they get trained and how they understand what they're doing when they're treating PTSD, what they understand to be PTSD.
So that's, and I'm hearing really kind of two very different approaches to the same problem. MaryCatherine, from a very internal, how is my narrative displayed to the world? How is my combat story essentially from inside to out? But then Marisa, from outside to in, for your perspective, the digital view, and just how sort of we absorb maybe the concepts of those kind of things from exterior to interior?
Yeah, well, how developers and innovators and philanthropists and people who see PTSD as a problem that they want to solve, how do they conceptualize that problem, and how does that get materialized in their interventions? And I think thinking my work against MaryCatherine's work can probably help us think of a lot of ways that there's a disconnect
right.
between that kind of technocratic but often very benevolent, well-meaning view versus what may actually be going on with the complexity of people's experience.
And I see that in the veterans, again, as I'd mentioned before, I listen to a lot of podcasts in the Change Your POV podcast network that I'm on now. Veterans are talking about trauma, they're talking about PTSD, they're talking about these issues, but there does seem to be a disconnect between them and the clinical mental health profession providing resources for that. So I really think that both of you bring a great perspective about that. So let's talk about PTSD in particular. And I guess, MaryCatherine, if you could start us off, the article really talks about sort of the history of PTSD. And a lot of veterans I know, we talk about Soldier's Heart in Civil War, we talk about Shellshock, we talk about all these things that people thought it was, but you went in greater depth in the article.
Yeah, I think what a lot of people don't realize is that we've been talking about PTSD, I'm putting this in quotes, but you can't see me, right? Since the 1800s, and Freud and Breuer and company, right? All those guys were pretty close to write about trauma,
right?
And I think that's something that has gotten forgotten because people, like to make a very blanket statement about psychoanalysis and about Freud and just say, well, Freud has been debunked and that's that. But if you read studies on hysteria, the way that they define Freud and Breuer, that is, trauma, is very close to what we have in the DSM right now, which I think is really fascinating. So I think it's important to look at the historical arc and kind of interrogate what that arc might mean. So one of the things that I've done some research on recently is the way that our conception of PTSD might be gendered in a negative way, and how it might sort of import ideas of like femininity and weakness. So in other words, to have post-traumatic stress disorder is to be weak, because the original sort of patients of hysteria, which is now PTSD, were all women. And so it was thought to be a disorder that originated in the uterus. It could only affect women. And then it became an issue of categories, because men started coming back from World War I and they had the same symptoms. So it was like, well, what is this? Right now we can't, it's obviously, it doesn't come from the uterus because men have it and they don't have a uterus. So how do we figure this out? And nobody really thinks about that history. But I think it's important because we have to think about ways that we've sort of like inherited negative connotations, and that ways that we might still be ways that those negative connotations might still be around. And so in the article, we looked at Louis Yeland, who's just one example of somebody who used a really brutal method of treatment under the sort of theory that if you had PTSD, if you had shell shock, it meant that you were suffering from, an astounding weakness of character, and you just needed to be snapped out of it. And that was strengthened by this fact that some people would come back from the same, Marisa and I could go to the same exact combat zone, get the same experience, and I could come back with PTSD and she could come back and be fine. And so people, that was reconciled by saying, well, you must be suffering from, something in your character, because why can you have something that Marisa doesn't have, even though you've had the same experience? And I think that those kinds of ideas, even though we like to think of ourselves as very far away from Yeland, are still around. And I think that's why the philosophical perspective in particular is so important, not because it should replace the scientific, but because it can have that critical eye toward treatment methods that the sciences don't always have, so that we make sure that we don't have these torturous methods still.
So that really makes sense. It's not a psychological disorder, or it wasn't considered back then. It was considered a moral weakness.
Exactly.
It was considered really a moral deficiency, maybe as like an intellectual deficiency, and people with just lower IQs were considered mentally ill. So it was a way of looking at it. But Marisa, we've come beyond that, I think. Maybe not. You're right, MaryCatherine. Not as far as maybe we should. But now we see it as both psychological, even neurological. How do you think we got from that moral deficiency standpoint to maybe even where we were in the early 80s to 90s and today?
Oh, that's a complex history. I think one little piece of it that's kind of interesting is that after World War I, and the revelations about people like Yeland, who were, submitting soldiers to these really brutal treatments because they felt that basically they needed to submit their will to a higher authority, as a way of reestablishing their masculinity, right? The masculinity of the doctor would be what would get the veteran in line. And actually, I think it was another person, Wareg, who was accused of war crimes, and Freud was asked to testify about what he thought of this. And Freud actually says, the problem is not that Wareg's a bad person, it's that he misunderstands what trauma is. Mm-hmm. And in the 19-teens, Freud was starting to become kind of a little bit of a celebrity in the U.S. And the American psychological apparatus was at first very interested in thinking about how to use psychoanalytic concepts to reconceptualize trauma, and took on one thing that got taken up was Freud's idea that you couldn't actually be traumatized in adulthood. You had to be traumatized at some point during your earlier development. And it was this reawakening of a trauma that would cause the difference between, say, me and MaryCatherine responding very differently to different experiences, which is why we have this stereotype of therapy as tell me about your mother.
Yeah, no, it's
which still persists. There have been people who still argue that in the late 1990s.
Yes, I mean, and that was especially in the 80s and 90s. There was the whole repressed memory movement, and awakening repressed memories and things like that. And it's great that you brought that up, Marisa, because I write that very clearly in some of my. It's not about your mother, unless your mother's the problem. Then we can talk about your mother. But rarely am I talking with veterans that I work with about their mother. And it does surprise me in as many things as Freud got right. He talked about neuroplasticity, decades before it was actually discovered, but then there was a heck of a lot that he got wrong too. But then moving from where Freud was, and then how it really developed in the 70s, after the post-Vietnam era, is when really they started talking about, okay, this isn't just something, this isn't just a condition, this is something psychological. So can you talk about how it first became a diagnosis?
Yeah, so the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, I'm trying to remember the dates for. I think the first one was like 1956, and the second one I want to say was 64. So the first one had this thing called gross stress reaction as a diagnosis, which could be used for things like people returning from war. But in 1964, I believe, when the second edition of the DSM came out, they took that out. And the theory is that this is probably because there wasn't anybody who had worked with veterans, in part, when that edition was coming out. But so there was a real problem in the late 60s and early 70s, because the military uses the DSM as its own diagnostic manual as well, and uses those categories. So what we saw happening in the 60s and 70s was veterans were coming home, and there was nothing that clinicians could give them in terms of the diagnosis that could attribute their war experience, their problems to their war experience. So they were getting these diagnoses like, personality disorders, schizophrenia, anxiety disorders, all over the place, and getting treated according to the rationales of those treatments. And one of the people that's credited with really making a huge change in that was I believe a social worker in Boston named Sarah Haley, whose father had been a war veteran, and who, when she started working with veterans in the VA, realized that what was happening to them wasn't some other thing, right? It was not some pre-existing condition, but it was something that could only really be explained by the trauma of their combat experience. So she and some of her colleagues started to put extra notes on people's medical files saying combat related, basically, and gathering this information that there wasn't any formal process to gather. But over time, Sarah Haley, along with, there were groups like Vietnam Veterans Against the War that started meeting and, separately and talking about their common experiences. And they had rap groups where they would discuss what their war experience was like and what kinds of issues they were suffering. And they started allying with other clinicians who were amenable to this interpretation. People like Robert J. Lifton, Chaim Shaitan, so Jan Berry, who I think was also a veteran. And this group started to work together to really create infrastructures for knowledge, to gather information about veterans. One of the big surveys was called the Vietnam Veterans Generation Study, and they surveyed thousands of veterans about their experience until they could make a case to the American Psychological Association that we needed something in the DSM that would account for these experiences. Because if for no other reason, without that diagnosis in the DSM that doesn't say this is a pre-existing condition, but says this is actually a war injury, you couldn't get disability compensation, right? You couldn't get any kind of formal acknowledgement, in addition to the issues of stigma, right? That people would have these real issues getting their medical treatment paid for, or being treated like they had a disability like anyone else whose ability to work is compromised through service-related sacrifice.
Yeah, and that's definitely and still a challenge. I like to, well, I don't like to, but I often do give the explanation. My father was a Vietnam veteran in 68, 69. Much of the reason why I joined the military and even perhaps why I pursued mental health. And so before he passed away, he was 100% service-connected for PTSD and some other injuries that he sustained. But that only happened in February of 2014. It took us nearly 50 years to be able to get to that point of being able to really even acknowledge and to separate it out, because it is this kind of a tangled web. It's not just one particular thing. And so, MaryCatherine, as far as maybe getting it into the DSM, the concept of PTSD has even evolved since then over the last 30, 40 years.
Yeah. And I think it's still evolving. And I think, so I was kind of part of I was a witness to some of the arguments about the most recent iteration of the DSM, which just was published in 2013. 13, yeah. Was it 2013? 2014, yeah. The DSM-5, which had a couple of changes in PTSD. And there was this big argument about whether or not PTSD should be reclassified as post-traumatic stress injury rather than post-traumatic stress disorder, because it's one of the only disorders in the DSM that is caused very directly by an external stressor, kind of.
Yeah, so in that's really interesting. There's a lot of people, I as a clinician, I recognize it as a disorder. A lot of people want to drop the D, right? That make it post-traumatic stress syndrome or PTSI, as you had mentioned, or things like that. Could you talk to us about the difference between what maybe the disorder and maybe not a disorder?
Yeah, so I think that the one of the things that people are really arguing about there is that one, it's that you have this, it's not sort of an organic or biologically based disorder or illness in the way that some mood disorders might be or schizophrenia might be. It's not something where you have a chemical imbalance in a clear way. Not that any sort of diagnostic is as clear as that, but to kind of use that as an example. But that you have this external stressor, and so that people want to draw a distinction between that kind of, you've gone through this experience and this has caused this set of symptoms. And so that's different than having this thing that sort of occurred in you because of this chemical imbalance or something like that. So there's that side of it. And then there's the stigma, right? So particularly with the population of combat veterans, nobody wants to be labeled with a disorder, right? Especially because, they've just gone and done something that they feel like is something that required a sacrifice, and they may be feeling shame about whatever, we could talk about shame for 2 hours. And, it might just not have lived up to their expectations and all of these things. And then, they come home, and I think, phenomenologically speaking, a lot of the symptoms that they have, if you take hypervigilance, for example, are the symptoms that they were trained to have that made them good soldiers.
Yes, absolutely.
And then you take them out of the situation, and then they have those same symptoms, and they can't shake them. And all of a sudden, those symptoms make them have a disorder. And I think that makes people in that population in particular less likely to seek help. And so I think the thought behind changing it to injury was that people would view it more along the lines of sort of a bodily injury, right? So they wouldn't feel shame about having this diagnosis. And so they would be more likely to seek help and less likely to suffer in silence. And then this would hopefully mitigate some of the, some of the suicide numbers.
Well, I can tell you that veterans don't need that much of a reason to avoid mental health treatment. So any reason's a good reason. So in my viewpoint, taking away the disorder piece would say, oh, well, it's not a disorder, so I don't need to get help. This is another way of a veteran saying, well, it's not really that big of a, it's just a natural reaction. And it is a natural reaction.
Right.
It's also an abnormal natural reaction or a negative natural reaction. That veterans can definitely manage.
I like to think of it as an adaptive set of responses that has crossed over to maladaptive. Okay, so you had these things that were adaptive and that kept you alive, and now we've crossed over to maladaptation. So how do we rein it back in?
Yes, that's a great way of framing it. It worked well in one environment; it doesn't work well in the other. I've written on my blog about the paradox of the veteran's emotion. Was when I was on patrol in Afghanistan, anger was necessary. It was the fuel, right? I wanted my guys and girls to be on edge and be on hypervigilance. And so those emotions, those thoughts that we engaged in when we were in combat, they're not effective here when I'm standing in the checkout line behind the nice lady who writes a check. Similarly, when I was in Afghanistan, I didn't want people, don't put pictures of mama and babies in your helmet, right? Leave that concern, that care, that cherishment, leave that for the base, the fob. Out here, I need your head in the game. And so it was really more of a suppression of the things that would be beneficial here, in at home, connected to family, being loving and caring. They were actually a detriment when we were deployed. And I think veterans, especially the veterans that I work with, have not really had a chance to be able to adapt back to an environment and sort of learn how to regulate their emotions. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that a lot of that is because people, I think a lot of this is it's our fault. It's the citizens' fault, because people come home and we think like, what's your problem? You're home. Right. So this is what you wanted. You're home. Now you're out of danger. So just adapt. Right. You adapted to combat. Why can't you adapt to home? But we need to provide people with better methods of doing that, because compartmentalizing in the way that you're talking about is not easy for everyone. Like it's not easy to just say like, okay, I'm going to just leave that there in combat and come home. Some people can do that with no problem, but other people have a really hard time. And then they get met with, what's your problem? Why can't you get over it? You're home, you're safe. Why can't you understand that? And I think this is what the phenomenological brings in that's so brilliant. It meets the patient where they are. Right. So instead of saying like from above, this is wrong, your perception is wrong, it says, okay, what is your perception and how can I understand it? And then let's go from there.
So that brings me back to you, Marisa, the way that say individuals or society or the way they communicate that message of just come back from combat, that fits, I think, along with the things you were talking about before, is how the message is delivered of, hey, become well.
Yeah, well, as you were speaking and talking about compartmentalization, I was also thinking about not just these messages that you need to become well when you come home, but also the kind of confounding situation that media creates for veterans who are deployed, right? Who, unlike many past generations, they can Skype home right?
Yes.
They can text home. It's not just a picture in the helmet, it's a picture on your phone. And maybe that picture is something that happened to your kid when they were at school today, right? Maybe that picture is a Dear John letter, right? There's all these ways that there is not a clear line between home front and battlefront that can create additional stressors, right? When people are deployed. And then to come home, and then those are things that they often don't have, control over because they're far away. And then, come home to not just expectations that they're supposed to just drop everything, but also a lot of images of the troubled vet, right? All of our movies about veterans are about PTSD. I did a content analysis a couple years ago. I just randomly selected several dozen stories under the search term veteran, homecoming, Iraq, Afghanistan. And 75% of my stories outside the week of Christmas mention PTSD and PTSD symptoms, right? So there's a sense that, even if you're expected to be normal, on the one hand, you're also not expected to be normal, right? And there's that stigma of people waiting for the other shoe to drop. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that answers any one question, but just to kind of complexify the messages that get disseminated.
Mm-hmm. And I think that goes back to the idea of much of what the communication is in the media about veteran mental health is centered on PTSD. Mm-hmm. I get this idea of it was very important to call it something, and then immediately after we called it something, it became that thing. It became everything that the veteran is concerned with. And going back to the case conceptualization of all of it, is the whole circle is PTSD instead of it just being one slice of it.
Right.
I guess believe it's beneficial. I can't even formulate the question. I'd like each of your opinions on the focusing on PTSD outside or in the whole total framework of veteran mental health.
Well, I guess I'll start with that. So when PTSD was originally conceptualized by people like I was talking about earlier during the Vietnam veteran movement, those the clinicians that were working with the veteran community had very much a social justice agenda, and they felt that what they were doing with creating this diagnosis was kind of speaking truth to power, right? To say war injures people, and this is real, and the government and the military need to be accountable to this, even when those injuries are not visible. And in kind of subsequent, but their only way to get this made visible to the military and to the relevant institutions was through medicalization, right? Was through inclusion in this DSM
to make it a pathologize it, basically.
Yeah,
yes.
Absolutely. And the thing is, it was maybe a little bit bad timing for their purposes, because the DSM was going under this radical shift where they were shifting from Freudian conceptualizations and these kind of other kind of models of self to a very symptom-based way of thinking about mental health disorders as, you just group people based on the cluster of symptoms that they have. And the issues of meaning or complexity really get erased from a lot of that. And so I'm like, you remind me of the original question, because I knew I was going for it.
No, you're doing great, but I just the idea of the focus of PTSD and how it's being focused on that, is that beneficial? But I hear you talking about moving from the philosophy, the philosophic understanding of what trauma does to an individual, moving to a more medical model, which both of you and your co-author wrote in the article.
So with this this move to the DSM and the symptom-based model, which was also another thing that was a big movement happening near that time, is the rise of cognitive behavioral psychology. You get people developing interventions that where the diagnosis is based on a checklist, right? And your measure of whether or not someone has gotten better is based on a checklist, right? It's kind of like black boxing in some way, the intervention. And because of that, all these other kinds of complexities, right? Things that it's not easy to make a checklist about. It's very easy to, how many nights have you not been sleeping, right? How would you rate your anger, right, on a scale of 1 to 5, right? These things are easy to measure, and the interventions that conceptualize trauma along a fairly kind of easy to intervene path, right? This person's having these cognitions, we're going to give them these cognitions. The person is afraid of these stimuli, so we'll expose them to these stimuli until they're no longer exposed, are very easy to operationalize in a medical model. And that's basically the only part that remains in our current definitions of PTSD, are the parts that are able to be kind of measured in these ways. Do you want to speak to that too, MaryCatherine?
Yeah, I'm going to say something more controversial, but but along the same lines. I just don't want to put these words in your mouth. So, if you go back and you read Louis Yealand's Hysterical Disorders of Warfare, what's I think especially chilling about it is that there is no doubt in his mind that what he's doing is beneficial for those veterans. And he's shocking them in the throat, and he's torturing them, and he's doing these terrible things, but they're getting better, right? The boxes are being checked, just like you were talking about. You've got these symptoms, we've got the symptoms squared away, and then the symptoms are going away. The veterans are walking out of the clinic, so they're getting better. And so my main worry is about reductionism, right? We're taking this incredibly complex phenomenon and we are reducing it to this set of symptoms. And to some extent, that is obviously necessary, right? But what I think we should always sort of return to is what I call a prismatic view, right? The one that looks from more than one perspective and takes those perspectives all into account, rather than just says, okay, well, screw neurology, or neuroscience, let's talk about philosophy, or screw philosophy, let's talk about psychology or psychoanalysis or whatever. Which is why, Dwayne, I like your conceptualization so much better, because it's so much more fleshed out and prismatic in that way. It takes all the pieces together, because I worry that if we think about combat as having one injury, right? So if you go to combat, you have one injury, then we have two problems. One is that anyone that has any complaint when they come back gets labeled with PTSD.
Which is where we're at right now in many ways, right? It's,
right.
Yeah. I mean, both society, so according to society and according to maybe the Department of Veterans Affairs or diagnostically.
Absolutely. Yeah. I just did a sort of a large study that we're just finishing writing up right now, that had 250 participants, and it was about reintegration, the phenomenology of reintegration. And almost everyone said, I came back and I reported this, even just as a story of something that happened in combat, and boom, you have PTSD. Here's your, bottle of pills or whatever. Here's, and I worry about that, because it's not only that it's not one injury, but there's not one treatment that's going to work for everyone. And Dwayne, you know this because you have a practice and you know that that's not how it works, right? But I think, and here's the scandalous part, we are advocating for prolonged exposure therapy as if it's going to help every single veteran. And it doesn't. It wasn't built for that. That's not what it was theoretically, imagined to do. And we put a lot of money behind it. And there have been veterans who've been speaking out and saying, hey, this was actually really torturous. And we're just saying, you know what? Science has the power. You had a bad experience and you just have, some other personality disorder, right? Which is what happened when David Morris wrote his book, The Evil Hours. He was just cast aside by science. And I think that's really scary, which is not to say that PET doesn't work for some people. It for sure does, and it's evidence-based and whatever. But I think if we have this reductionism, then I think things can get really scary. That's my worry.
Well, and I don't know that it's entirely scandalous because I happen to believe you and agree with you, MaryCatherine. I firmly do believe that if an individual, it's a veteran, but if an individual if their sole concern is post-traumatic stress disorder from a single event or something like that, then prolonged exposure therapy does work, and it is evidence-based very, very well. Same thing with CBT, EMDR is another thing.
Yeah.
If that is what the veteran their only concern is, then yes, it is very, very effective. And I have colleagues that swear by it. However, like you said, and this is what we're told, is if it doesn't work for your client, you, the clinician, are doing it wrong. Or the client is not, or that's not what it is. As I've been talking over these last 6 months or so about this conceptualization, I showed it to a veteran one time, and we just kind of walked through it, and I was saying, is this something that makes sense? And he was like, you're kidding me, for the first time, because he had been told PTSD. He said, my explanation of moral injury was much more in line with what he personally felt like he had. And he was like, what is this moral injury? I had one veteran one time that said, once he read Litz et al., their description of it, he was like, I feel like Benjamin Franklin, who just discovered lightning. It's always been there. It's just now somebody put it in words for me. So, no, I don't think that's scandalous at all. I'm right on the same page.
Some people get really fired up because that's...
because it's and this is in my experience, in this conceptualization, as we're talking about that, nobody's going to be an expert in every single thing. There's going to be people that are very familiar with interventions for substance abuse, and they're not working with family systems. And then there's going to be individuals who are very neurologically based that are not familiar with maybe really existential psychology and things like that. And so if we are to ensure that the veteran gets the best care, we should get them to someone, go from the general to the specific. Hey, this is your concern. Let's help you out. Now, this has been a great conversation. We're coming up on an hour, and I think we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more I think that we could talk about this, and I really appreciate both of your insights on really PTSD and how it's evolved. I'd like to give each of you, a couple minutes maybe to wrap things up, or maybe something that we've talked about that you think would be beneficial for further reflection. Marisa?
Well, I think one thing that's important, just reflecting on your what you two were talking about, is to keep in mind that when people are giving this PTSD diagnosis, they often think they're doing the veteran kindness by making them eligible for service connection, right? There's no service connection for moral injury.
Right.
It's considered an adjunctive, treatment that can help for the pieces that the exposure therapy doesn't get at, right? These kinds of things. So if we want to take things like your conceptual model seriously, we also have to think differently about things like disability benefits, compensation, the whole kind of apparatus that supports a limited conceptualization, as well as, the medical and scientific models that underlie these interventions. And I'm optimistic that, the insights of people doing other kinds of work and creating other kinds of conceptualizations, like MaryCatherine is working on, can lead us to more holistic treatments. But I think it's also important to remember how difficult it is to make those scientific to make those things considered scientifically sound, and get institutions, right, not just us talking about what would be better, to take them up. And I know there's people doing all kinds of interesting things to try to work, at the margins. I know some therapists who they'll say they're doing exposure therapy just because they got their patient to talk about what happened. They may do that in a lot of different ways and just say, oh, it was exposure. But if that stuff falls outside of the way that we're actually making knowledge, it's might be helping some people, but it's not going to change the system. And we really have to rethink the system.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm all about rethinking systems. So, MaryCatherine, some final thoughts?
Yeah, just going on that, I think that we're going to see some more changes in the next DSM. I think moral injury will appear. And I think that I know that Russell Carr went to Congress and talked about the importance of creating phenomenologically based treatment methods for veterans. So I think that there's stuff that's happening that's real, and it's part of the reason why I did a big research study, because it's like big numbers get you attention.
Yeah, no, it does.
But then in terms of just one last thing, I think that one of the ways that I want to rethink things theoretically for the benefit of people who are traumatized is that I think that something that I've really been astounded by in my research of veterans and talking to people who have encountered trauma in their lives is what I thought about theoretically, but then saw in really vivid color talking to people, which is that these responses, these symptoms are rooted in this adaptive urge to survive, which means that on a really essential, foundational level, PTSD comes from strength, not weakness. And I think that we need to rethink that on every level, so that people who have PTSD or people who get this diagnosis, if we stick with this medical model, can shake the shame, because I think that's a major barrier for wellness.
So, and that's interesting, and and again, that sounds like an entire show in and of itself. But the idea that a veteran, for whatever reason, decided to step forward and put themselves in a situation in which they were potentially traumatized, that was an initial strength of theirs.
Right. And that all of their symptoms come from, like we were talking about before, like this, what kept them alive, right?
Right.
Yeah. That's awesome.
No, that is, and I'm going to chew on that. I definitely want to have each of you back for your own show, because Marisa, just the concepts you were talking about how we society display the message. That sounds like something I would definitely like to get into further. And then MaryCatherine, I didn't even talk about the yoga and the embodied trauma and everything else that you were doing, because that, in my mind, it's a huge aspect. Yoga and just these embodied interventions as adjunctive to therapy, rather than either they're standalone. Hey, just go ride horses and you'll feel better. But really having this integrated piece. And so I really enjoyed having you both on. And then I enjoyed it so much I'd like to have each of you on at some point in the future. Now, I'd like for each of you to, if someone were more interested, to reach out to you to get more information about the work that you're currently doing, or really to maybe have a conversation about the things that you've been talking about. MaryCatherine, how can people get a hold of you?
Email is the best way. So I have an email address through ODU, it's just mymcdona@odu.edu. My McDonald, like my Sharona.
So I'll make sure that email, I might link to my Sharona in the show notes, but I'll make sure that email is in the show notes. And Marisa, for you?
Yeah, same. My university email is a great way to get in touch with me. It's my last name, Brandt, BRANDT, M7 at msu.edu.
Okay, I really want to thank you both for coming on the show and giving us your insights.
Thank you so much. This was a great chat.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a great conversation.
Hard work, hard work. Hard work, hard work. Hard work.
Thanks for taking the time to listen to that great episode with Dr. MaryCatherine McDonald and Dr. Marisa Brandt talking about PTSD.
That's what I say. Hard work, earn my pay. Hard work,
You can find the show notes on this show and many of the things we talked about at either changeyourpov.com or veteranmentalhealth.com, looking for episode HST028.
hard work, another day to work. Hard work.
This is the 4th episode of Veteran Mental Health Boot Camp, a series brought to you by the Change Your POV Podcast Network and the Headspace and Timing Podcast.
Got to go make the call. Hard work, banging on the doors in the morning. Hard work.
If you're a veteran or service member, the family member of one, or support veterans in any way, then this series is designed to help you understand more about veteran mental health.
Hard work, manifest. Hard work, you gotta do it right. Hard work.
If you're just now getting into the series, go back and check out episode HST025, where we introduce the concept of looking beyond PTSD and TBI in regards to veteran mental health.
Work, we're going on out. Hard work, we gotta go and do the job. Hard work, load them up on the airplane. Hard work, in the early morning rain. Hard work.
Make sure you subscribe to the Change Your POV Podcast Network on your podcast player of choice and sign up for updates at changeyourpov.com and veteranmentalhealth.com.
Fired up. Hard work, everybody on the plane. Hard work, sit them on down. Hard work.
We would love to hear your feedback regarding this series and all of the shows in the Change Your POV Podcast Network. You can do so by visiting our Facebook group, leaving a comment or review on iTunes.
Hard work, I earn my pay. Hard work, we're on the hard work.
Remember, veteran mental health and wellness is the basis of a successful post-military life, and one that all who answered our nation's call to serve deserves. Remember, brothers and sisters, you're not alone. Ever.
That's what I say. Hard work.